At 12:06 p.m., the order system crashed with 14,327 customer shipments trapped in limbo. What they did not understand was that locking me out at 9 a.m. had not removed a risk. It had disabled the only person who knew where the risk was hiding. They called it a security precaution. I called it an executive mistake with a timestamp. By noon, their warehouse platform was frozen, customer orders were disappearing from the dispatch queue, and the manager who cut off my access was asking whether IT could quietly let me back in. Every story here is about someone who got underestimated and made them regret it. My name is Dana Pierce, and for 7 years, I worked for a national home goods company called Hearth and Field. We sold furniture, lighting, rugs, kitchenware, and seasonal decor. Nothing life or death. But when you sell large items online, logistics becomes everything. A customer can forgive a delayed candle. They do not forgive a sectional sofa that vanishes between a warehouse and their front door. Hearth and Field had grown quickly. Too quickly, if I am being honest. When I started, we had 4 distribution centers and about $38 million in annual online sales. By my 7th year, we had 11 warehouses, a direct-to-consumer website, wholesale accounts, marketplace partnerships, and nearly $240 million in annual online revenue. The company had grown. The systems had not grown with it. That was where I came in. My official title was Director of Order Operations. It sounded ordinary. It was not. I managed the workflow between the moment a customer clicked place order and the moment a package, pallet, or freight delivery actually left one of our warehouses. Orders entered through the website. They passed through inventory checks. They were assigned to warehouses. They were screened for fraud. They were split if items shipped separately. They were routed to carriers. They were tracked through dispatch. Then they were reconciled against payment records, inventory records, and customer notification records. On a normal day, the system processed between 18,000 and 24,000 orders. During the holiday season, it processed more than 40,000. If one part of that chain stopped talking to another part, customers saw one of 3 things. Their order disappeared, their card was charged twice, or their package never left the building. None of those outcomes ended well. Most executives understood the big picture. They understood sales. They understood marketing. They understood that a warehouse needed workers and trucks. But very few understood the logic underneath it all. The order platform was called Atlas. Atlas was old. Not ancient, exactly, but old enough that its original architects had left the company years earlier. It had been patched, expanded, integrated, and modified so many times that nobody could honestly say it was simple. It had a warehouse routing engine, a payment status engine, a carrier label service, a fraud review queue, a customer notification module, and one small nightly process called the order release sweep. That sweep was my responsibility. Every weekday at 11:45 a.m., Atlas checked all orders that had been held for one reason or another. Inventory mismatch, fraud review, address correction, shipping rate failure, a payment authorization delay. It then determined which orders could be released back into the normal fulfillment queue. Most days, the process was invisible. That meant it was working. But if it failed, the entire warehouse network backed up. The release sweep could not simply run on its own. It needed someone to monitor exceptions. Someone who knew which holds were real, which were temporary, and which were caused by one system failing to update another. For years, that person was me. I did not build Atlas. I did not write code. But I knew how the business worked inside the system. I knew that an address correction hold from Ohio was different from an inventory hold from Nevada. I knew that a payment delay affecting a furniture order could not be handled the same way as a payment delay affecting a $19 lamp. I knew that if the carrier label service lagged by more than 12 minutes, the release sweep had to be paused manually. I knew which alerts mattered. And I knew which ones looked harmless until they became expensive. I had asked repeatedly for a deputy. Not because I thought I was special. Because I believed every important process should have trained coverage. I trained analysts. I created documentation. I built checklists. I ran monthly incident simulations. But there was always one problem. I had no authority to give anyone permanent access to the controls that mattered. That authority belonged to IT. And IT reported to a vice president named Grant Harlow. Grant had joined Hearth and Field after the company hired a new chief operating officer. He came from a much larger retailer. He wore tailored suits to warehouse meetings. He called employees by the wrong names and corrected no one when they corrected him. He had a strange habit of tapping his pen against the conference table whenever someone explained a process he did not understand. Tap, tap, tap. Then he would say, "Let's not overcomplicate the basics." That was Grant's favorite phrase. Let's not overcomplicate the basics. He used it whenever someone raised an operational concern that did not fit into his plan. A warehouse manager warned that weekend staffing was too thin. Let's not overcomplicate the basics. A customer service leader said the return policy was confusing customers. Let's not overcomplicate the basics. I explained that Atlas had 2 approval layers for order release because a bad automated release could create thousands of incorrect shipments. Dana, let's not overcomplicate the basics. He thought confidence was a substitute for understanding. And, because he had a title, people around him started treating his certainty like expertise. Then came the cost-cutting initiative. Grant called it Project ClearPath. The purpose, according to his presentation, was to eliminate unnecessary manual intervention from order operations. The phrase sounded reasonable. Nobody wants unnecessary manual work. But Grant did not distinguish between unnecessary intervention and informed oversight. To him, they were the same thing. He looked at the time I spent reviewing exceptions. He looked at the salary attached to my role. He looked at the number of orders that processed automatically. And he came to the wrong conclusion. He decided I was watching a system that did not need to be watched. At a leadership meeting in early October, Grant presented a new structure. Atlas would be managed by a centralized systems team. Order exceptions would be handled by a rotating operations desk. The 11:45 a.m. release sweep would become fully automated. My position would be transitioned out within 30 days. I asked one question. Who will own the exception rules after the automated release? Grant glanced at his slide deck. Atlas will. I asked again. Who will own the decision when Atlas flags an order incorrectly? He looked annoyed. The system is designed to make those decisions. I said, the system was designed to flag uncertainty. A person still has to understand what the uncertainty means. Tap, tap, tap. Grant looked at me and said, Dana, you have made yourself too central to a process that should be routine. The room went quiet. Then he added, no system should depend on one person's instincts. He was right about that. No system should depend on one person forever. But a company does not remove a person's access, ignore their documentation, and call that resilience. That is not succession planning. That is guessing. My final day was scheduled for November 3rd. I had 1 month to transition my work to the centralized team. I prepared detailed instructions. I created a 72-page operating guide. I listed every exception category. I mapped escalation paths. I recorded training sessions. I documented the release sweep dependencies. And I wrote a specific warning in bold letters on page 41. Do not automate the 11:45 a.m. order release sweep until carrier label latency monitoring has been independently validated during peak volume. I sent it to Grant. I sent it to IT. I sent it to the operations desk. And I asked for a written response confirming who would own the process after I left. Grant replied 11 minutes later. Received. We will proceed with the plan. That was all. Then, on November 3rd, they locked me out of the system at 9 a.m. Grant thought locking me out would prove that the company had outgrown me. What he did not know was that a change made at 8:47 that morning had triggered an old flaw inside Atlas, one that stayed invisible until the 11:45 release sweep began. By then, I would not have access, authority, or any obligation to save them. I knew something was wrong before 9 a.m. Not because I had access to the system. Because I was still sitting at my desk, finishing my final transition notes, when my password suddenly stopped working. I was reviewing an open exception report. I clicked refresh. The screen froze. Then a login page appeared. I entered my credentials once. Denied. I entered them again carefully. Denied. At 9:02 a.m., I received an automated message from IT. Your system access has been disabled in accordance with your employment separation. My separation meeting was scheduled for 10:30 a.m. My final payroll paperwork had not been signed. My laptop had not been returned. But someone had disabled my access anyway. I walked to the IT office. A systems administrator named Miguel was sitting near the door. Miguel had worked with me for years. He looked uncomfortable when he saw me. "Dana," he said quietly. "I was told to disable everything at 9. I asked, by who? He looked down. "Grant." "Was the release sweep reassigned?" "I do not know." "Was the exception monitoring dashboard transferred?" "I do not know." "Was anyone given the emergency override key?" He hesitated. Then he said, "I do not think so." That was the first mistake. Not locking me out. Companies have the right to control access when someone leaves. The mistake was locking me out before confirming the work had actually moved somewhere else. Grant had confused security with preparedness. He had taken away the person who knew the process without making sure anyone else knew it too. At 9:15 a.m., I sent an email from my personal address to HR, Grant, and the Chief Operating Officer. The email was short. My system access was disabled before my scheduled separation meeting. Please confirm in writing who has been assigned responsibility for the 11:45 a.m. order release sweep, the exception monitoring dashboard, and emergency override authority. I did not accuse anyone. I did not sound angry. I asked a professional question. At 9:21 a.m., Grant replied, "Dana, the process is now automated. There is no need for concern." No need for concern. I read it twice. Then I forwarded it to my personal attorney. Not because I was planning a lawsuit. Because I had learned something during 7 years in operations. When someone puts confidence in writing, save it. At 10:30 a.m., I attended the separation meeting. Grant was there. HR was there. The COO joined by video. They told me my role had been eliminated as part of Project ClearPath. They thanked me for my contributions. They offered 8 weeks of severance. They reminded me of my confidentiality obligations. I reminded them that I understood them. Grant said the company had standardized a process that had been too dependent on individual knowledge. I asked, "Who is monitoring the release sweep today?" He smiled. "The system." I asked, "Who is reviewing the carrier label latency exception?" He shifted in his chair. "The systems team has it covered." I said, "Can you tell me who on the systems team owns it?" The room became quiet. HR looked toward Grant. Grant looked toward the COO screen. Then the COO said, "Dana, we have all the information we need for this meeting." I nodded. That answer told me everything. No one owned it. At 10:54 a.m., I turned in my laptop. At 10:58 a.m., I walked through the lobby carrying one box. A notebook. A framed photo of my daughter. A small desk plant I had somehow kept alive through 4 holiday seasons. And a ceramic mug that said, "Keep calm and check the logs." It had been a gift from my team. I put the box in my car. Then I drove home. By 11:20 a.m., I was sitting at my kitchen table. I made coffee. I opened my personal laptop. And I looked at the email Grant had sent. No need for concern. At 11:47 a.m., my phone buzzed. The first call came from Leah Monroe. Leah was one of the analysts I had trained. She had been moved to the centralized operations desk 2 weeks earlier. I answered because I cared about her. "Hi, Leah." She sounded breathless. "Dana, I know you do not work here anymore, but the order queue is doing something strange." I kept my voice calm. "What kind of strange?" "Orders are releasing, then disappearing from warehouse assignment." "Did the sweep complete?" "I do not know. The dashboard says completed, but the dispatch queue is not moving." "Who is your incident lead?" "Grant is in a meeting." "Who has emergency override authority?" "I do not know." There it was. The question I had asked twice that morning. The question no one had answered. I said, "Leah, I cannot access the system or advise on active operations without an agreement. But you should document the exact time the problem began and escalate it through your incident process." She said, "We do not have an incident process for this." I paused. Then I said, "Then send the timeline to Grant, IT, and the COO. Put everything in writing." She thanked me. At 11:56 a.m., She called again. This time, she was more frightened. Dana, the warehouse in Kentucky is calling. Their pick lists are blank. That meant the order release sweep had processed the release status, but failed to create warehouse routing records. The orders were technically alive, but the warehouses could not see where to pick them. I asked, has IT acknowledged the issue? Yes. They said they are checking the database. Has anyone paused the sweep? I do not think so. That was the second mistake. When a system begins creating incomplete order records, you do not keep pushing more orders through and hope it fixes itself. You pause the process. You isolate the failure. You stop the damage from spreading. But nobody had authority to make that call. At noon, the system crashed. Not gradually. Not politely. 1 minute, the dispatch queue is lagging. The next, Atlas stopped responding. The customer service dashboard froze. Warehouse scanners could not retrieve new pick lists. Carrier labels stopped printing. The fraud review queue filled up. And 14,327 orders became trapped between payment approval and warehouse assignment. By 12:06 p.m., the company's customer service team was already receiving calls. Customers were getting order confirmation emails with no shipping dates. Wholesale partners were asking why their bulk orders had disappeared. 2 warehouse managers were texting Grant directly. The chief operating officer was calling IT. And Grant was trying to run a crisis meeting with people who had no clear answers. At 12:11 p.m., my phone rang. Grant. I let it ring once. Then twice. Then I answered. Hello, Grant. He did not say hello. Dana, we need you to help us understand the release sequence. I said I no longer have system access. I know that. Then you need to contact the systems team. We have. They are working on it. Good. He was silent for a moment. Then he said, there is an issue with Atlas. I assumed there might be. His voice hardened. This is not the time. I said, you're right. This is the time for the people assigned to own the process to own it. He took a breath. Then he said, can you tell us how to stop the sweep? I looked at the clock on my kitchen wall. 12:13 p.m. I said, Grant, I cannot provide operational instructions without a written consulting agreement, defined scope, and access to the relevant information. He said, this is a company emergency. I understand. You worked here this morning. You disabled my access this morning. He paused. Then he said, do not make this personal. I said, I am not. I am making it professional. He ended the call. At 12:19 p.m., I received an email from HR. They requested an urgent transition call. No terms. No scope. No mention of payment. Just a meeting link. I did not join. Instead, I sent one response. I am willing to discuss independent consulting support for a defined operational incident. Please have legal send a written proposal. 3 minutes later, Grant called again. This time, he was not angry. He was worried. Dana, 14,000 orders are stuck. Then you need a plan. We need you. That is not the same thing. He said, what do you want? That was the first satisfying turn. Not because I enjoyed hearing it. Because for months, Grant had treated my work like unnecessary complexity. Now he had to admit the company needed the knowledge he had dismissed. I said, I want a written agreement. I want a defined role. I want access approved by legal and IT. I want authority to coordinate the incident. And I want to be paid as an emergency consultant. There was silence. Then he said, send your terms. I sent them at 12:31 p.m. My attorney had already prepared a standard emergency consulting template because we had discussed it during my separation review. My rate was $500 per hour. There was a 24-hour minimum, paid in advance. The scope was limited to the Atlas outage, order recovery, and operational stabilization. I would not be responsible for any system changes I did not approve in writing. I would have direct access to the COO. And no communication to customers or vendors would refer to my recommendations without my review. Grant called immediately. $500 an hour? Yes. That is excessive. No. It is the emergency rate for a person you removed from the system during a live transition. You were making less than that yesterday. Yesterday, I was an employee. Today, I am not. He said, you are taking advantage. I said, no, Grant. I am setting boundaries around work your company failed to prepare for. At 12:44 p.m., Hearth and Field accepted every term. At 12:51 p.m., the payment cleared. At 12:57 p.m., temporary system access was restored. And when I logged in, I saw the problem immediately. The failure was exactly where I expected it to be. At 8:47 a.m., before they disabled my access, IT had pushed an update to the carrier label integration. The update was supposed to improve shipping rate calculations. Instead, it changed one response field inside the warehouse routing process. The field was still there. It just had a new format. Atlas did not recognize the format. So when the 11:45 a.m. release sweep began, it did what it had been programmed to do. It attempted to release held orders. It checked for carrier label confirmation. It failed to interpret the updated response. Then it marked the order as released anyway. The order had left the hold queue, but it had not entered the warehouse queue. It was floating between two systems, invisible to the people who needed to pick it, visible only as an error pattern in a back-end report that nobody had checked. The system had not suddenly broken at noon. It had been breaking quietly since 11:45. And, because Grant had turned the release sweep into an automated process without validating the carrier label monitoring, it had kept processing more orders into the same failure. I called the emergency incident meeting. Grant joined. The COO joined. IT joined. Warehouse leaders joined. Customer service joined. And I started with the only sentence that mattered. Stop the release sweep now. Grant said, will that delay more orders? I said, the orders are already delayed. If you do not stop the process, you will create more incomplete records. He looked toward IT. The lead engineer nodded. Dana is right. That was the moment Grant lost control of the room. Not loudly. Nobody challenged him. Nobody said he had failed. But the people who understood the work began looking to me for the next decision. I asked IT to roll back the carrier label update. They said it could take 45 minutes. I told them to begin. I asked the warehouse teams to stop releasing any manual orders from their local queues. I asked customer service to use a specific message for affected customers. Not an apology that promised a delivery date we could not meet. A clear statement that orders had been received, were being processed, and would receive an updated shipment notice once fulfillment resumed. I asked the finance team to freeze automatic cancellation triggers. If we allowed the system to cancel orders that had already been paid for, we would create a second crisis involving refunds, duplicate charges, and inventory errors. Then I opened the order exception report. The report showed 14,327 orders affected, but not all in the same way. Some had valid inventory. Some had expired authorizations. Some were wholesale orders with different shipment rules. Some were large freight items that needed manual routing anyway. Some were duplicate orders created when customers hit refresh after the website became slow. We had to separate them before the system could restart. That was where the work slowed down. Not because anyone was wasting time. Because fixing a system is not the same as cleaning up what it already did. At 1:22 p.m., the IT team completed the rollback. At 1:31 p.m., the carrier label integration began responding correctly. But I did not restart the release sweep. Not yet. Grant asked why. I said, because we need to verify the queue before we move another order. He sighed. He wanted speed. Of course he did. The company was losing money every minute. But rushing was what created the failure. I said, if we restart without isolating the incomplete records, Atlas will reprocess orders that already have payment holds and duplicate records. We could turn 14,000 delayed shipments into 14,000 customer service cases. The COO said, do what you need to do. That was all I needed. At 1:45 p.m., I assigned a recovery team. Not based on job title. Based on the actual work. One IT engineer to validate systems. One operations analyst to sort order categories. One warehouse leader to confirm routing behavior. One customer service manager to control communication. One finance analyst to watch authorization and refund triggers. And me coordinating the sequence. The same company that had decided one person's knowledge was unnecessary now had 6 people working under a plan I created. At 2:10 p.m., we isolated 9,846 orders that could be safely restored once the queue was rebuilt. At 2:36 p.m., we identified 2,911 orders requiring manual review. At 3:04 p.m., we discovered 1,570 orders with conflicting inventory or payment statuses. Those would take longer, but the majority could be saved. At 3:17 p.m., Grant asked if he could send an update to the executive team saying the issue was fully resolved. I said no. He looked irritated. The system is backup. The system is stable. The orders are not fully recovered. What is the difference? I looked directly at him through the video call. The difference is the truth. Nobody spoke for a moment. Then the COO said, "Dana will provide the update." So I did. I wrote that the system outage had been contained. I wrote that order processing had resumed under controlled conditions. I wrote that approximately 14,000 orders were under recovery review. I wrote that the company expected most affected orders to ship within 24 to 48 hours. And I wrote that a full incident analysis would follow. No false promises. No vague language. No attempt to make the crisis sound smaller than it was. At 4:20 p.m., the first restored orders began appearing in warehouse queues. At 4:46 p.m., Kentucky resumed printing pick lists. At 5:05 p.m., the first carrier labels printed. At 5:40 p.m., the first delayed shipments were moving again. The company had not escaped without damage. 3 major wholesale accounts demanded credits. Customer service received more than 4,000 calls that day. The company spent nearly $280,000 in expedited shipping over the next week. And the outage delayed enough orders that Hearth and Field missed a key weekend sales target. But the system was alive. The customers were informed. And the warehouse network was functioning. At 7:15 p.m., the COO called me privately. She sounded exhausted. Then she said, "I owe you an apology." I did not rush to make it easier for her. I said, "What happened today was preventable. I know. The documentation was there. I know. The risks were explained. I know." She paused. Then she said, "Grant made the decision to disable your access before the transition was complete." I said, "Grant made that decision. But the company allowed him to." That was the truth. One arrogant manager can cause damage. But organizations create space for people like that when they reward certainty and ignore the people closest to the work. The COO asked whether I would extend my consulting agreement for 30 days. She wanted me to lead a full recovery review. She wanted me to train a permanent backup team. She wanted me to redesign the order release process. I agreed, but not under the old terms. My new agreement paid $500 an hour for emergency work and $350 an hour for recovery and training work. I reported directly to the COO. Grant had no authority over the project. And before I accepted, I asked for one thing in writing. A named succession plan. Not a promise. Not a slide deck. A documented plan identifying trained backups, emergency authority, access protocols, and monthly system tests. The COO agreed. Grant was removed from Project Clear Path the following Monday. 2 weeks later, the board paused the entire initiative. They discovered that other departments had experienced the same pattern. Experienced staff removed. Processes declared automated. Risks ignored because they were inconvenient. Grant resigned before the end of the quarter. The official message said he was leaving to pursue another opportunity. But the people who stayed knew what had happened. At 9 a.m., he locked me out to prove I was unnecessary. By noon, the system had crashed. And by the end of the day, everyone understood the difference between dependence and expertise. The lesson is not that you should become the only person who understands an important system. That creates risk for everyone, including you. The lesson is that documentation, cross-training, and access planning have to be real. A folder full of notes is not a transition plan. A recorded training session is not a qualified backup. And removing someone's access does not transfer their judgment to a software platform. If your job involves systems, Operations, clients, money, compliance, or anything that can fail quickly. Document your work professionally. Keep records of your accomplishments. Keep copies of your own performance reviews and job descriptions where permitted. Follow confidentiality rules. Never take company data you are not entitled to have. But make sure the value you created is visible before someone tries to rewrite the story. And if a former employer calls during an emergency, do not let urgency pressure you into informal work. Ask for a written agreement. Define the scope. Clarify your authority. Protect yourself from responsibility for decisions you cannot control. Know your rights. Know your boundaries. Being untouchable does not mean nobody can lock you out. It means that when they do, your expertise remains clear, your professionalism remains intact, and they cannot use their own poor planning to turn you into an unpaid rescue team. The next story begins when HR called me into a 4:59 p.m. meeting and said, "We're going a different direction." They thought cutting the person who managed their biggest vendor relationships would make the company leaner. 6 months later, unpaid invoices were stacking up. The vendors stopped answering their calls, and that different direction led straight to bankruptcy court. Subscribe, because when they finally asked me what went wrong, I showed them the warning email I sent before they fired me.